Hello, I'm Cheryl Lenifel, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and it is my honor every year to join so many of you in Selma to commemorate the anniversary of Bloody Sunday and to commemorate the courage of those who have fought for voting rights over decades. I come each year because it refreshes and renews my own resolve to continue in this work and to commemorate not only those who marched, but also the LDF lawyers who represented the Selma marchers, ultimately assisting with the preparation of the route for the final march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. As many of you know, I am stepping down as President and Director Counsel next week. And so this is the last time I will be appearing in Selma as the leader of LDF. But it is not the last time that I will be in Selma, and I intend to continue my lifelong commitment to this important work, and especially my commitment to the right of everyone to vote and participate in the political process. I want to thank you for your willingness to tune into today's panel commemorating the 57th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and that march from Selma to Montgomery. As you know, this panel is one that we resuscitate every year, hosting an event to honor this sacred history and bringing together some of the sharpest minds in this work. These conversations are meant not only as a commemoration of the mobilizations that ushered in the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but as a continuation of the ongoing fight for the right to vote. This panel is usually hosted at Brown Chapel AME, the historic church where foot soldiers retreated in '65 after violent assaults by state police. The church is undergoing renovations this year, but we look forward to returning when the pandemic has passed and renovations are complete. We're grateful for the continued partnership of Pastor Leotis Strong and the broader Brown Chapel AME community. Today's panel is entitled Democracy at a Crossroads, Building Power and Promoting Truth in 2022, and will explore critical tensions our nation faces today. The stakes for our democracy could not be higher. We are in the first federal election cycle since 2020 and early 2021, when historic Black voter turnout was followed by an insurrection on our Capitol. Our democracy must choose to fight for the vote at the state and the federal level, in the courts and at the polls, or we'll succumb to suppression and dilution. We are in the midst of a redistricting cycle that will shape power and representation for the next decade. This year, we will draw the lines both for our political districts and our political norms. We're in a fight for truth. As new forms of misinformation and disinformation aim to distort trust in the political process, we also face renewed threats of censorship, erasure, and book bans. Our nation must decide whether we will face the hard, uncomfortable, and vital truths of our past and our present, or risk repeating our worst failures. We cannot make progress without first confronting our past. Indeed, our nation is at a crossroads. The future of our democracy depends on the paths we choose. Luckily, we have a wonderful group of panelists who are ready to tackle the tough questions about where we are and about where we're going. Morenike Fajana is an assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she works both on our voting rights docket and our campaigns to push back against bans on truth. She brings experience in both nonprofit and government roles, engaging in litigation, policy, and advocacy matters to advance civil and human rights. Errin Haines is editor-at-large and a founding mother of The 19th, a nonprofit independent newsroom focused on the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. She has broad-ranging experience as a journalist, commentator, educator, thought leader, and soon-to-be author on topics of race, ethnicity, gender, and politics. Evan Milligan is the executive director of Alabama Forward, a statewide civic engagement table advancing efforts of nonpartisan organizations throughout Alabama to greatly expand the voter base, protect voting rights, and make election systems as accessible as possible. Evan is a native of Montgomery with a depth of experience in community organizing, policy, and law. He's currently the lead plaintiff in the recent challenge to Alabama's congressional districts under the state's redistricting plan. Professor Melissa Murray is a professor at my alma mater, New York University School of Law. She's a leading expert in family law, constitutional law, and reproductive rights and justice. A former law clerk for Sonia Sotomayor, then on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and Stephen Underhill of the District of Connecticut, Professor Murray has become a leading commentator on the Supreme Court and the legal culture that surrounds it as a co-host of the wildly popular Strict Scrutiny Podcast. We're grateful for each of these panelists and look forward to their insights today. Thank you for tuning in, and let's remember this fight will not end until every person can participate fully in the electoral process and control their destiny. So grateful to be with you today and looking forward to this fantastic conversation.
Hey family, I'm Brittany Packnett-Cunningham, and I want to welcome everyone to Democracy at a Crossroads, Building Power and Promoting Truth in 2022, a panel hosted by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that commemorates the 57th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery and Bloody Sunday. LDF was involved in the very first Selma to Montgomery march, securing the legal victory that finally allowed the march to proceed successfully, and they've participated in commemorations in the decades since. It is so important to look back on this monumental day in our history, but also to understand how vividly this event resonates in 2022. 57 years ago, foot soldiers like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and Amelia Boynton Robinson braved horrific state-sanctioned violence as they attempted to march in peaceful demand for our right to vote. Because of their bravery, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. And this midterm election year, which began on March 1st in Texas, the stakes for our democracy could not be any higher. As we enter yet another year without federal voting rights legislation, it is so important to celebrate the mobilization of Black voters, organizers, and poll workers during the 2020 elections. But we also must gear up to defend our democracy against broad attacks and fight for the right to vote in the courts, in the streets, and at the ballot box in 2022. Our democracy is at a crossroads, but we can honor all the sacrifices made that day on the Edmund Pettus Bridge by pushing this country to live up to its highest ideals, to the promises it made us. Today, we remember the bridge and we fight for the vote.
Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining, whether you're here in Selma, whether you're watching at home, and thank you all to our panelists for participating both virtually and in person with me here. We're really excited about having this conversation today, and it was great to hear from Sherilyn and Brittany just to help us contextualize this moment and help us start thinking about why we're here. Some of you might recognize the landscape behind myself and Evan. We're here in Selma. We are directly in front of the Alabama River and the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And we thought that it's important for us to physically be here while we have this conversation as we start to think about why the narrative of Bloody Sunday, of the march from Selma to Montgomery, is so important. And I was wondering, Erin, if you could kind of kick us off and just help us understand why we're still here 57 years later talking about those events.
Sure. Well, Morenike, first of all, it's great to be with you and with Evan on the screen, if not in person. I have covered the Bloody Sunday commemoration as a journalist for many years. I'm an Atlanta native. Congressman Lewis was actually my congressman. And so, as a Southerner, as a Black woman, and as somebody who's concerned about the future of this democracy, this anniversary is absolutely one that feels urgent. And so no surprise that you all are down there this weekend and hopefully, with everything that's going on in the world, the nation and the planet can really turn its attention to Selma for just a moment to think about where we've been, where we are, and where we go from here. So thank you for helping to facilitate that conversation, and thank you for asking me to participate. So, I think that President Eiffel and Brittany really did kind of tee up the framing for the moment that we find ourselves in, I think commemorating the sacrifice and the courage of those who are known and unknown in the fight for voting rights is always an important reminder of the fragility of our democracy, but also the need for constant vigilance in defending our democracy. I think that's something that many Black Americans and many women and marginalized folks in this country have known for generations. But this year in particular, I think the Bloody Sunday anniversary should have resonance again for all Americans who are concerned about the threat to our democracy and access for free and fair elections for everybody, regardless of your politics, regardless of your party, even if you have no politics. That access is something that is under threat and that should concern us all. So, there are many lessons that we can take from March 7th, 1965. I think among the most important, I would say, is probably the lesson of perseverance, because we know that this was a long fight and that victory was not won in one session of Congress, in one election cycle, and in the space of one administration. And I know that, we live in a day and age where people are used to things happening much more quickly and change, especially big systemic change, is not often something that happens very quickly. There are many people that lay the groundwork, that lay the foundation for that work, and we know that takes a long time. And so putting that into perspective for people, I think, is definitely part of my role as a journalist and what we should be doing as we talk about this issue of voting rights. Another is that there was a right and a wrong side on this issue almost 60 years ago. And the press covering voting rights during the civil rights movement framed the issue in just that way. So I really think that we cannot in 2022, we can't afford to try to both sides, if you will, the reality that there is an attack on access to the ballot and that those attacks are aimed at marginalized communities in an attempt to achieve a certain outcome. And that's not being partisan. That's not, that is a fact. That is the truth. And so small d democracy is not objective. And journalism, we certainly believe at a newsroom named for the 19th Amendment, should be biased on the side of voter participation for everybody. We have an obligation to leave behind an honest and accurate record, I think, of where we are as a country, just as those who did this job before us did nearly 60 years ago.
Thank you, Errin. What you just said about being biased for democracy, being biased for making sure that the political process remains open, just makes me think of a question for you, Professor Murray, and that's, how do you think that both journalists and also jurists and legal scholars and advocates are actually talking about this moment? Is it fair? Is it accurate? And is there harm being done by kind of weighing both sides?
So thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here to commemorate the 57th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery and, of course, Bloody Sunday. And it's great to be in conversation once again with my good friend Errin and to meet all of you. I want to pick up on a thread that Errin said about the sort of the desire, especially when we are talking about the work of the Supreme Court or the federal courts or the justice system more generally, to think about things in a sort of abstract, both sides, giving every position fair play. That is what we are taught to do in law school. It's what I try to do as a law professor, to ventilate both sides. But I do think there is some danger to doing so because, as Errin suggests, it gives the impression that both sides are equally good. And I think in the case of sustaining a thriving multiracial democracy, that isn't the case. There is one side to it, and there is a side that is very much against it. And I think the both sides now rhetoric sometimes disadvantages that. And so, I'm going to leave behind my professor persona and sort of think about myself as a commentator. And one of the things that really prompted us to start our podcast, Strict Scrutiny, is because we really believed that the commentary around the court emphasized that kind of professional neutrality. And in so doing, really neglected the degree to which the work of the court has real life consequences in the lives of minority communities, marginalized communities. And so, when you read about Evan's case in the New York Times and the fact that the Supreme Court allowed Alabama to use its redistricting map that basically confines minority communities to a single district in the state, and minority representation to a single district in the state. It's presented as a sort of both sides kind of issue in the front pages of some of the most important newspapers in the country. But that is a real consequence for people on the ground in Alabama. And indeed, it is a harbinger for what is to come as we pick up more and more challenges to the franchise as we go forward to the 2022 midterm elections and then to the 2024 presidential election. And so there's a lot at stake here. And one of the reasons we wanted to do a podcast was to show that this wasn't something you can be neutral or abstract about. You have to be in the fight, and the fight we're on the side of is democracy. So we really try to talk about what this means. And one of the things that we've emphasized over and over again on our podcast is we are fighting a fight that is occurring both in majoritarian institutions, the ballot box, the political process where allegedly the will of the majority will prevail. And that's the reason why we are seeing so many assaults on the vote. The fact that so many people from communities that historically have been marginalized came out in 2020 to vote means that majority will is going to be different going forward. And that's why you're seeing such an effort to limit the expression of that majority will. But we are also seeing a fight in minoritarian institutions. I'm thinking specifically of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a minoritarian institution. And what we are seeing in our politics is if you cannot win in the majoritarian political process, you either disrupt that process by limiting the participation of the populace in the ways that we're seeing in the voting rights context, or alternatively, you take your fight away from the majoritarian process to the minoritarian institutions. And the Affordable Care Act is a great example of this. We saw John McCain famously vote thumbs down on repealing the Affordable Care Act in Congress. And then days later, we saw the Republicans file suit in a Texas district court to overrule the ACA, something they could not accomplish through majoritarian politics. So we are seeing this fight play out on both sides. And again, when you hobble the democratic process, when you hobble voting rights, it just means that these minoritarian institutions are actually insulating themselves from the backlash of their decisions. We are going to see the backlash, or maybe we won't, because that backlash will have been dimmed by the limitations on those expressing themselves and their outrage in the voting booth. So again, two fights, all of it inextricably intertwined, and this is a really timely and urgent conversation.
I'd like to bring Evan into the fold right now, just because you mentioned his case and talking about making this fight less abstract, more concrete, and more real. And so, Evan, I was wondering if you could talk to us kind of about what's at stake for your case right now, and maybe let folks know why you decided to get involved in doing political participation work in Alabama.
Thank you. I guess in terms of what's at stake for us, this case, if we're about to close the book on an era of American history where we had a certain understanding of what civil rights norms were in the country, or just a general understanding of the spectrum, I think if we're gonna, voting to affirm the state of Alabama's map is sort of doing that, because it would involve undermining Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which has already been narrowed, and that's sort of the last remaining enforcing measure there with teeth. So if we're going to close the chapter on that, in the worst case scenario, we should be able to look in the mirror after we see that ruling and know that we did everything we could to change the climate around the importance of democracy and voting rights. And I think, that might sound alarmist, but between now and well, they'll argue it hopefully in early October, I think, but the ruling would come down early 2023 or by early summer. So we have between now and then to really build some bridges that we haven't seen within our pro-democracy movements. And then as far as how I got into the role, I've pretty much been doing activist or advocacy work in Alabama since I was 16, but definitely as an adult. And when I started working at Alabama Forward in late August of 2020, and then once we hit 21, we knew redistricting was going to be the focal point for us. So that was my entrance into the conversation, really trying to get resources to our member groups.
Can I just chime in here, because I don't want it to be lost on folks. I mean, what Evan is doing is on a continuum and in a long tradition of folks who have stood up on behalf of himself and on behalf of others to make sure that their freedoms are not curtailed and that they are allowed to participate in this democracy. I mean, there was a Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson. There was a Brown in Brown versus Board of Education. Milligan versus Merrill. Like, this is Milligan. Like, I just want people. I don't want this connection to be lost on people. Like, there are people at the center of these fights. It should not be abstract for people, and people should absolutely understand that there are very human stakes and very human stories to be told in these cases that we just kind of talk about in terms of names or places or even issues, but really losing the idea that there actually is a Milligan, and he and his co-plaintiffs, we should know who they are. We should know what their stories are, and we should know exactly why they're here. So I'm so glad that you are here to be able to tell us a little bit more about, just who you are as a son of Alabama who is wanting to fully participate in his democracy.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to highlight, especially this point about just lifting up certain narratives, reminding people who actually stands behind certain cases and the work that it gets done to bring cases to the fore. Given the situation that we're in right now in Alabama and really in other states across the country where we have a number of legislative proposals as well as bills that have been enacted that could restrict which narratives can be shared, that can restrict what concepts can be taught in schools and discussed. What tools do you all think that we have to combat that, whether that's in the courts again, legislatively, organizing and activism? How can we push back so that 50 years from now, people are learning about Evan Milligan in school?
Yeah, well, look, I can start this one off, but I do think, as journalists, we are charged with writing that first draft of history, right? And to make sure that we are leaving behind that honest and accurate record about where we are and what happened, to us as a country. We remember the civil rights movement partly because there was a press that understood the absolute human drama of this moment, and they covered it as such, right? And so we do our audience, we do our fellow citizens a disservice if we don't dramatize the stakes of what is happening, or if we just reduce the conversation to these kinds of stories about process. History is not going to remember process. It remembers who did what and why and what that meant for our democracy. And so this should be our focus. That should be our narrative. When, an 8-year-old comes along in 50 years and says, what happened in the summer of 2021 with federal voting rights legislation, that parent is not going to tell their child, the answer is not going to be the filibuster. They're not, they will talk about the story of what happened in this moment, the people who were fighting on both sides of this issue, and what it meant to the voters who were impacted by that decision. So this is the way that we need to think about this, to talk about this, because, you know, as journalists, so much of what people understand about this conversation, because they are just trying to live their everyday lives and they aren't necessarily going to all of these places and covering all of these things with the attention that we are, because that's not, I mean, it is literally our job and obligation to do that on their behalf.
I also think related to what Errin has said is that, you know, we need to do as good a job as putting ourselves in the center of that story as those on the other side have done. So think, for example, of the critical race theory discussion that's going on right now in so many localities around the country. That is a narrative that is almost entirely centered around the needs of white parents, in much the same way the mask mandate debate has been centered around the needs of white parents. Black parents, Latino parents, Asian American parents, we're parents too. And this history that has been limited and stifled and honestly parsimonious in its account of the struggle of this country is a history that our children inherit. And so, you know, one of the things I think we can do, in addition to all of the things that we've seen our ancestors do in the past, including marching and filing lawsuits, is we can put ourselves back in the center of the story. We are parents too, and we actually don't have a problem with critical race theory, because critical race theory and the shorthand that they are using for critical race theory is really nothing more than telling an account of the United States that actually includes us too. And so I think that's a very sort of small but powerful thing that we all can do in our local communities, to just put ourselves and our children and our families at the center of some of these debates, to make it less abstract and to make clear that there is not just one side to this, and there isn't a default that looks like one group of people. We are part of this conversation too.
I would just say, in terms of telling the story, you know, as from the plaintiff side, it's not something that we want to wait and just assume someone will do. We want to start telling our own story and really working with national partners in the Deep South, you know, here locally in Alabama, to build a movement, a pro-democracy movement, or really add to the pro-democracy movements that exist in a way that can really you know, cultivate the emotional core of this story, which is, you have Shalila Dowdy, who's one of the plaintiffs, Kadita Stone, Dr. Adia Winfrey, Letitia Jackson, Bernard Simulton from the NAACP, other organizations. These are people with families. So imagine a national sort of movement that, as one of its many, you know, points of focus, is lifting up the narratives of those folks before one of us is shot by the police, or before, not because of something related to death or tragedy, but because of the connection to what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. I think that would just be disruptive on so many levels. And, you know, that's one of the things that we want to do right now, is be a little bit disruptive of the way we're not totally sensitive to how our country is just really going off the precipice in a direction that's not democratic. So yeah, we want to be a little bit louder in telling our own stories.
Yeah, I love that idea, and I love that framing of being disruptive and trying to take back some of the power in telling stories about civil rights, about justice, about, you know, Black people and the respect for Black lives, really. I also wanted to go back to something you said initially, Evan, which is, you know, if the maps that are drawn now are affirmed after the Supreme Court's decision, can we look ourselves in the mirror and say that, you know, we're satisfied, that we're happy with everything that is done? And I'm just wondering if that, let's say that's a consequence going forward, and this is a question for everybody, you know, what happens now? If we have a Section 2 that is potentially weaker, we have a Section 5 that's also been gutted, we have Brnovich, we have a lot of other district court opinions that really are saying, well, you can use partisan motivations to do whatever you want. And if, minorities are harmed or fewer people have access to the right to vote, that, that's fine. That's still lawful. What avenues, if any, will we have in the courts if that's our reality?
That sounds like one for Melissa to me.
Well, Evan was going to jump in too. Evan, do you want to go first?
I was going to say the word you use, minoritarian. I hadn't heard that before, but the idea of what's at stake is, shifting in a much more pronounced way in that direction. But yeah, I want to hear what Melissa says too.
No, I think this is a really important moment where, we have to face the reality of what we have in the Supreme Court that we have. We are faced with an historic nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson. That is certainly something to celebrate, but we also have to take with that the fact of a 6-3 conservative supermajority that really is poised to unravel a lot of the gains that we have seen over the past 50, 55, 70, 75 years, right? So, we have a court right now that is pretty blatant in its hostility to women's reproductive rights. We have a court that is very much enthralled with an idea of colorblind constitutionalism and the idea that any consideration of race is per se impermissible and should be invalidated. And they believe this as they are poised to take up affirmative action in the next Supreme Court term. And they have actually facilitated the dismantling of the scaffolding of democracy. In 2013, we had the Chief Justice of the United States writing a 5-4 majority opinion in which he invalidated Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act. That's the preclearance formula for the Voting Rights Act. And it basically took away the protections that we had in many of these jurisdictions who had histories of blatant voter suppression. Under the Voting Rights Act and the preclearance regime, they had to actually go to the Department of Justice to get any changes in the voting law, whether it was moving a ballot box, whether it was moving a precinct, adding drive-through voting, anything they wanted to change in their voting systems, it first had to be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. And Chief Justice Roberts writes in that opinion that a scheme like that essentially holds us hostage to the past. And he notes that there has been huge progress in minority voting in the South. And because of that huge progress, which as then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg noted was because of the Voting Rights Act and the preclearance formula, we don't need it anymore. So again, this sort of narrative of racial progress is one that only runs in one direction and doesn't even contend with the possibility that there might be retrenchment. And we are certainly seeing retrenchment now. The 2020 election was an opportunity for us to see firsthand what it means to no longer have a robust preclearance regime in place. We saw lots of jurisdictions taking steps to limit access to the ballot box. We had Houston, one of the largest cities in the South with a sizable African-American population, attempting to winnow down voting and voting access to just a single precinct in that massive, massive urban metropolis, something that could not have happened under the preclearance regime. When the court struck down the preclearance regime in Shelby County, they noted that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act still stood, and that is the part of the act that allows for litigation against those jurisdictions that are perceived to be doing things that suppress the vote. But last term in Brnovich, the Arizona voting rights cases, we saw the court narrow the definition of what could count as a discriminatory voter suppression method. And again, allowing the states to do more in the name of preventing electoral fraud to limit access to the ballot. And so that provision, Section 2, which was supposed to be a fail-safe, is now sizably narrowed. And we also have the court in 2019 in Rucho versus Common Cause telling us that federal courts have no jurisdiction, cannot stop the problem of partisan gerrymandering. That's something that can only be done on the state levels. Note that it is the state legislatures themselves that are doing the partisan gerrymandering. So it's a little bit like telling the burglar to put back all the stuff he burgled from you. So we have a court that's literally doing the most to hobble voting rights. And one of the reasons it is so effective, and it's so effective for this court, is it means they can do everything else in all of the other areas, reproductive rights, education, and we won't have a way to register our discontent with those decisions because they have so limited the vote that they are insulated from public backlash to their decisions.
Yeah, and I think that is absolutely a narrative that the press should be hammering home for people, the context that they need to be giving, whoever their audiences are, in terms of what the stakes are. I think going into 2018 and 2020, there was a lot of, whether it was, in papers of record or on cable news or, others, who were writing opinion pieces, there were people who were kind of saying, oh, well, we don't really know what the impact of these laws is going to be or what the impact could be. We do know what the impact is. Even if, intent obviously is not something you can't get into the hearts and minds of people necessarily, but you can chronicle impact. And I think that we as journalists have an obligation to do that. I think that we are seeing that happen increasingly, but it will be very important. I mean, this midterm cycle is really a huge test of what people's access to the ballot is in the wake of the onslaught of voter suppression legislation that has been passed in state legislatures across the country, and in the absence of federal legislation and a weakened Voting Rights Act still on the books. And so what does this first election cycle look like? What can we learn from it? What do we need to take from that headed into 2024, right? Because this is not just about 2020. This is not just about the big lot. Like, this is absolutely about subsequent elections and laying the groundwork for future elections. And so, and what the impact is going to be on those elections, how even this strategy is tweaked and adjusted, what 21st century voter suppression looks like, how they adjust their strategy as a result of whatever they see in the 2022 midterms in elections up and down the ticket, from the federal all the way down to the very, very local of levels. And so that's really important. Also, hearing from voters, again, centering the voters who are going to be impacted in this moment about what their reality is at the ballot box is going to be hugely important. Hearing from voters about what they think their redress even is to their government to make sure that they are not disenfranchised, and what happens if they are disenfranchised. Again, because this is not something, a fight that is limited to the courts, continuing to ask this administration, what are you doing to ensure that voters, I mean, if this federal legislation is not going to be in place, what is the federal government doing to ensure that voters have access to the ballot, even as the states, so many states are implementing measures that will present obstacles to those people having the ballot? What is the strategy for voter education? What is the strategy for voter protection if somebody casts a ballot that is then, and then there's an attempt to negate that ballot, to toss that ballot out, right? We have to continue to ask all of those questions. And then, of course, this was actually something that the President Eiffel and I discussed in a conversation that we had last year about the future of voting rights. And that is just the idea that, I think it is on all of us as journalists who are covering this issue to get a lot more familiar with the entirety of the Voting Rights Act. Yes, Section 2 and Section 5 have absolutely been gutted, but there are many other sections of the Voting Rights Act that our government can be using to protect voters in this moment. The question is, will they? Are they? And what is the plan for using whatever tools that they do have to make sure that voters are protected and feel empowered and not scared going into 2022, 2024 and beyond?
Another issue to flag, both for the media and for voters, Errin, is this ascendant narrative of the independent state legislature doctrine, which is going to be heard by the court. This is the idea that state legislatures, and not state redistricting commissions or state Supreme Courts for that matter, can have any say in the electoral processes of an individual state. This can only be done by the state legislatures. There are a number of different state legislatures that are pushing this doctrine. They happen to be those that are controlled by the Republicans at this point, but it's also getting a lot of play at the Supreme Court. It was a fringe first floated in 2000 in Bush v. Gore. Only Justices Scalia, Thomas, and I want to say one more, maybe Kennedy, signed on to it. But it's now gotten more favor, and we saw it come up in a couple of the election cases from 2020 on the shadow docket. And there were 4 justices, all of them conservative appointees, who seemed to signal their interest in this particular doctrine. And now there's a case coming before the court. And it looks like Justice Barrett might be the deciding justice to actually take this fringe theory that was once off the wall and actually make it on the wall. And it will have enormous consequences for things like just electoral changes to state electoral processes and the Electoral College, and whether or not the state legislature is authorized to substitute a slate of electors for those selected by the people themselves. And it has not gotten a lot of press coverage at all, but it is monumental and will have huge repercussions for democracy.
Well, thank you as always for putting yet another thing on my radar. Evan, I saw your hand go up.
I just wanted to ask a question just to follow up for both you, for Melissa and Errin. So when you think about what you've just laid out as far as the trajectory, do you see us having an intervention point culturally, socially, before we've crossed the path in the conflict cycle that is sort of much closer to, maybe something more chaotic? Like, where do you see the interventions? Do you think it just has to play out where it bottoms out, or what?
I don't know the answer to that, Evan, but I will. What I can say to you is, we know that Selma was a catalyst to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You don't have LBJ, sitting in Congress telling the country we shall overcome and signing this legislation without the events of March 7th, 1965, and what the nation saw on their television and what they were shocked by and horrified by, even if they didn't live in Selma, in Alabama, in the South, if this wasn't their community, if this wasn't somebody who looked like them who was being beaten and bloodied on that bridge. As Americans, they got it, that this was a threat to democracy and that it was not okay. We have not seen people taking to the streets en masse regarding voting rights. That certainly was not what we saw last summer. I don't know that is, whether that is something that we are going to see. I'm certainly not predicting anything as it comes to our politics right now, because I could not have predicted this moment if I had tried. I don't think I could have predicted this moment, but I do think, the idea that the idea that mass mobilization and the optics of that absolutely can have an effect on public opinion. We've seen it on other issues recently in this country. I mean, Black Lives Matter at the 10-year mark here. I mean, so much of what has helped to change public opinion about the idea that the unrelenting killing of Black people in this country by law enforcement and vigilantes is something that shouldn't be acceptable to people in this country. That happened because, people took to the streets, and even in the midst of a pandemic, you had a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-gendered coalition of folks rejecting that. That has had an effect on how our fellow citizens now view this issue. Folks on both sides of the reproductive rights conversation have taken to the streets on this issue, have flooded capitals, have flooded Washington to make their voices heard. That is something that gets the press's attention, which is then something that gets people watching those reports. It gets their attention. And so, I don't know if we will see increased efforts to that effect around voting, but I certainly am paying attention and wondering if you see those kinds of crowds outside of a place like Selma.
Well, can I disagree slightly, Errin? I will be the first to say, there has been a lot of stuff to protest in the last 2 years. So And I would not fault anyone for not having
not at all.
the attention span to sort of stay on it. But I am surprised, like certainly with the reproductive rights situation, that we are not seeing daily protests in front of the Supreme Court from now until June, when this opinion is released. We had some engagement when oral arguments took place in December, and then it's all sort of trickled off and it's been very episodic. I think for something like this, we've got to have, we have to keep the pressure on all of the time. And again, all of these things are inextricably intertwined. Like, you don't get restricting reproductive rights laws like the one in Texas and the one in Mississippi unless you have gerrymandered the state so entirely that you've limited the way people can express themselves at the voting booth. And then you have these legislators who are gung-ho on restricting women's rights to choose. It's inextricably linked. Access to the political process cashes out in all of these substantive ways in policy. And so, for me, the most important message I got was, I spent much of 2020 sitting at home in the pandemic, but also calling people and getting voters out in all of these swing districts, Wisconsin, in Georgia. And it was the first time I'd actually participated on sort of a retail level in politics. And, my husband was like, that stuff never works. It was like, I actually didn't know what else to do. Mm-hmm. Like, to me, it just seemed like that election was so cataclysmic and so defining of a generation that I had to participate, that I had to do something. And I feel a little bit about the midterm elections that's coming up in the same way. And I'm going to do the same thing. Like, I think we have to go out. I talked to so many young Black people who were not planning to vote in the presidential election because they didn't see the point of it. And, I just spent a lot of time trying to tell people there was a point, and this point would have real implications for their lives. But that's something you can only do if we all take the time to actually sit there and talk to our communities and get people out there. Like, they are trying to limit the vote. The only thing we can do is push more people into that stream so they can actually get to the ballot box. And maybe some of us will push through and will be heard. But as they try and narrow it, we have to overwhelm them with people who can vote, who are eligible to vote, actually going out there.
Just on that point of, young people and people in Gen Z who may have voted for the first time in the presidential election in 2020, taking stock of some of the issues that mattered most and that matter most to that group: the environment, healthcare, student loan debt, climate change. You can imagine that voting bloc has reasons for feeling, perhaps disillusioned. And I'm just wondering, for each of you, what should we say to that 20-year-old, 22-year-old today to explain why it's important for them to vote in the midterms or to vote in local elections this year?
What I think, I personally believe that it's important to vote every cycle. Every cycle is important. I'm somebody who, my mom took to register to vote 3 days after I turned 18. I vote because I am a Black American. I was a Black American before I was a journalist, and I will be when I eventually retire from journalism. So, voting really is about, just the idea of one person, one vote. Like, that is something that I take very seriously. And the idea that we are all supposed to be equal on election day, that is something that I continue to believe should be true, even as there are daily threats to whether or not that will remain true for us as a democracy. And so really, my participation in this process, what I tell other people about their participation in this process, is that it's not about any one cycle. It's not about any one person. It's not about any one party. Like, it is about your ability to exercise your power and to participate in this society, in this democracy. And the idea that nobody should be able to take that away from you.
It's also, I think, we have to emphasize for I think those who are disillusioned and disenchanted, the importance of margins here. And I talk to my students about this a lot. Many of them are frankly disenchanted with the Democrats because of the failure to do more on student loan debt or more on the environment. But that is often a question of margins. We are a 50-50 split in the Senate. Nothing can happen without the Senate. And we have a 50-50 split. President Biden, to do anything, needs every Democrat to vote in line, which gives outsized power to those who know that they are sort of poised to be spoilers, right? So there are, 2 senators who come to mind. If we had a wider margin, if voting turnout had actually turned some of the states that were sort of purple turning blue, actually blue, if we'd been able to pick up more senators in some of those places that look really contested and close, we wouldn't be having the conversations we're having right now about Build Back Better, because we wouldn't need to compromise on some of these things. So all of these things cash out directly in the ballot box. The gains you see at the ballot box have real and meaningful implications in how policy gets made at both the federal and the state level. When you have the numbers, you don't have to concede things to the other side. And so, if you want student loan forgiveness, if you want greater progress on climate change, that has to be translated into wider margins in electoral politics.
I would add that, they're emphasizing local elections and local ballot measures and local policies is going to be critical to inspiring younger people and people who are currently registered to vote, who vote infrequently, is really critical to linking them to what they can see, people that they're likely to encounter on the street or just out and about in their lives. And I think about the strength of movements that really work across class divides and age divides within Black communities, because of how much information can be lost during moments of large scale generational transition like what we're currently in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, it's important to communicate the local impact, but also just the tradition of survival of our people in this country. And there's a legal scholar I was catching up with yesterday, Dr. B. Carter, has this theory that Black identity and the quality and length of Black life in this country is sort of a avatar for the quality and accessibility of democracy in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So when we have moments of extreme, not democracy, of citizenship in this country. So when we have moments of extreme repression of Black life and subjugation of Black communities, those are the moments where our definition and the empowerment of the office of citizen is at its lowest. And in the opposite, when we are most liberated, then the office of citizen is at its most powerful, at least for the United States, just in terms of the legal development of the country. And that was just really an inspiring frame to think about. All right, here's this like a major intellectual scholar sort of person, and then how would the people in the biker community, Black bikers, what's the way we could just say that, but then what's the way that feels visceral to them to experience that same concept, and then on throughout our niche communities. And just thinking about it, that gives me a lot of hope. And it also gives me something very solid, because if we are in a worst case scenario, like if we have a situation like what we all felt in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, let's say we have the natural and man-made versions of that, Oakland, Chicago, Baltimore, wherever. How are we going to connect with our people? The same networks that we would use to survive that are the same networks we can be using to inspire people to vote. Same networks we would use to move food and to get people from one place to another in the country. So that's the sober, like the more cynical side of me, still being motivated to do the same type of organizing.
Evan, I everything that you're saying is so true and helped me kind of. People that were doing just the kind of work that you're describing really helped me as a journalist understand the connection between power and the Black community, and how the vote was literally the bridge for that. I think the pandemic was particularly clarifying on the point that you are making, because the same people that I saw organizing people to register to vote and to turn out at the polls, those were the same people that were helping those voters, right? Not, right before the election, helping them for months leading into the election with food assistance, with rental assistance, with childcare. Trying to find childcare resources so that they could stay employed if they found themselves unemployed, trying to help them with resources for that. Things that did not, that were not necessarily going to translate into support at the ballot box, but that they understood, like, if these people are not well and they are not whole, then, they are in survival mode. They are not necessarily thinking about going to the ballot box. And it can't just be about securing that person's vote. Caring for these communities holistically is something that I saw happens over and over again in so many communities. And so I really think that you were making a very important point there. And that's something that we should be doing a better job of covering, as a press, everything that these organizers are up against and everything that these voters are up against as they, are trying to not just participate in, but thrive in this democracy and thrive in this society. The idea, thinking about the notion of civic health, the conversation that you were having with that legal scholar yesterday, the health of our citizens in terms of their access to participation, like that. That is a really interesting framework to consider in terms of how we can talk about this issue, because I think for too many people, a conversation about voting rights versus voter suppression it doesn't give them a way in. It should, I think, but I understand that it doesn't. The reality is that it is not a way in for everybody. And so what if we started talking about civic health and the health of our citizenry and their ability to participate? I think that is a really interesting framing that could bring more people into this conversation who are not here, but who should be here because of the threat to our democracy.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And Evan, I want to thank you for, in the midst of a conversation of a lot of negative or maybe harsh truths and realities, for bringing us some light and bringing us some hope as well. And I just wanted to pose the question to all three of you, what makes you hopeful or feel hope in this moment right now?
For me, it's I see that there are Black people in leadership positions in all spheres of our society here in this country and even globally at a rate that none of our prior generations have had access to. And so, if some of those survival tactics that our communities have devised here in this country and elsewhere were, they devised that with much fewer resources than what we currently have. And that the downside of that is we have so much comfort and space for disassociation from each other's struggles, isolation. Then on the upside of it, if we're able to lean into culture and our creative impulses and our creative traditions, we have tools that can transcend the space and the isolation. And so I'm hopeful about that. I'm hopeful about the way we can use those tools and really the hard work our ancestors and elders have been doing to get us in position to move the needle further.
I would start by saying the people of Selma give me hope. The story of Selma gives me hope. On this 57th anniversary, being reminded of their courage and of their sacrifice gives me a lot of hope for what is possible when everyday people stand up and try to make a difference on behalf of themselves and the people that they love and their communities. I'm also hopeful that we are in a moment where there is increased attention on the issue and the importance of voting rights, especially from our press, which means that there could be increased momentum to get something done. And by getting something done, I'm not suggesting that Congress is the only avenue for action. I think that we have to pay attention to evidence of that happening across the country in ways big and small, because all of that work contributes to our national efforts to preserve our democratic ideals and our democratic way of life. So I hope that we will see more stories about the people who are continuing to push back on the attacks to their right to civic participation, so that people understand this is not a foregone conclusion, right? It may look like one side is winning, but there are people that are actively fighting and actively working to continue to perfect this union and to continue to make sure that all of us are able to vote safely and freely and fairly. And I don't want that to be lost on people in this moment, because we are in the midst of a long struggle that preceded us, and we'll be here after we have passed from the scene.
For my part, I will just say that I really take inspiration from the terrific work that LDF is done and is continuing to do in all of this. It has been a leader in protecting the vote. And honestly, the three of us would not be here if it weren't for the absolutely path-breaking work that LDF has done in integrating all aspects of American society. And so that cannot be understated. And it continues to do that great work today. Every time I get ready to discuss something that's going on at the court and I look at the docket, I always see a brief on one of the most important issues, and even some of the issues that Americans don't realize are that important, from LDF, calling attention to the way in which a ruling from the court on this issue will affect marginalized communities all over the country. So this work is so important. I'm so proud to have been an alumna of LDF and its community of young lawyers at one point in time. I received a scholarship from LDF at one point that enabled me to go to law school. And now I have students who are recipients of LDF's amazing, groundbreaking generosity. One of my students here at NYU is one of the inaugural Marshall Motley Fellows, a really generous program to fund the next generation of civil rights lawyers who are actually working on the ground in the South. And so, LDF has its hands in many pots, but all of those pots are absolutely pivotal for creating the scaffolding that will hold up this infrastructure of democracy.
Thank you so much for that. I think I can speak for all of us at LDF when we say we're so grateful to do this work. We're honored to do this work, and we're really honored to carry out the legacy of LDF and its founders. And thank you all so much for this incredible, thoughtful, insightful, and really meaningful and needed conversation. It's really been my personal honor to be able to just help facilitate and speak with you all and just hear what you're saying. So I really, really deeply appreciate it. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I just want to share some final information and a few slides just talking about some of the work that LDF will be doing here in Alabama over the course of the weekend and also the next few weeks. So as I mentioned earlier, there are different legislative proposals actually pending with the Alabama Legislature that pertain to education and how certain topics can be taught in schools. And there will actually be a hearing on one of those legislative proposals. That's House Bill 312. It's going to be happening on Wednesday, March 9th at 3 p.m. at the State House in Montgomery. If you want to learn more about that hearing and also LDF's other pro-truth work in Alabama, please visit the link at the bottom of that slide. The next thing that I wanted to lift up, as has been the theme of the day, is just to learn more information about all the different voting rights work that we do at LDF, redistricting, volunteer opportunities, to find out about Evan's case and other cases that we're litigating, you can visit voting.naacpldf.org. And then for folks who are presently here in Selma or in Alabama right now, we hope to see you on the bridge tomorrow. If not, if you're not able to attend in person, please tune in online starting at 10 a.m. tomorrow for the Sunday service that will be hosted by Brown Chapel AME Church. And we're asking that folks please pre-register for that event online using Eventbrite. So that's just some more information about the event tomorrow, where our Director Eiffel will also be honored. So for folks who are going to be here past the weekend, as some of you may have heard, we're going to be having a full march from Selma to Montgomery, starting on Sunday, going an entire week until Friday, March 11th, concluding with a rally at the Alabama State House in Montgomery on Friday, March 11th. And to learn more about that, you can go to the Selma to Montgomery March.com. And then finally, you can also download the official application for the march using Crowd Compass events to see what the program and the schedule is for each day. So these are lots of different ways for folks to get involved. And again, we thank you all for listening and participating with us today.